but we're going to move on to Greg Endres next to keep on schedule. And so our last presenter before our break that we had this morning is Greg Endres, Extension Agronomist at the Carrington Research Extension Center. So Greg, if you're on and unmuted, go ahead and take it away when you're ready.
All right, good morning. So let's move right to the next slide. I have 4 studies that I'd like to discuss with you. If you look at the fourth one, that's a brand new project that we're formally starting this spring, and it should complement the study that Caleb talked about earlier, only we're looking at a spring application of low rates of dicamba. Then you notice studies number 1 through 3 all involve cover crops. So here's why I'm really interested in cover crops: to reduce or eliminate soil erosion. And so in addition with cover crops, we do have the opportunity to have another weed control tool in our toolbox. So I love this picture. This was taken by Abby Wick. And so we have things accomplished, like I just mentioned. This was with winter rye in soybean. We have nice ground cover, and we also certainly have weed suppression. So this is study number 1. I have visited with you in the past about this work, and now we've completed it. So what we're after is if we plant cool season cover crops late in the summer, can we effectively establish them if previously we applied soybean herbicides that has a soil residual? And this work has been supported by the Soybean Council. So a quick look at the database we've generated. In 2016 at Fargo, Kirk Howard started an initial trial. And then since then, we've been conducting this more formal study in Fargo and Carrington since 2018. And the soybeans, herbicides, as well as the cover crops, those that are bolded are the core group that we did test at both locations and over years. So just give you a little bit about materials and methods. We did plant the soybean in the latter part of May each year, and the appropriate rate and timing of the herbicides were made. And then typically in the first half of August, we did mow down the soybean. Generally, they were in the seed production stage. And then we planted the cover crops perpendicular to the direction that we had applied the herbicides. And so the table that's shown is just an example, and this is from Carrington in 2019, but this shows the herbicide treatments and then also the response to the cover crops that we evaluated. And our evaluation was a visual assessment of both impact on biomass as well as on stand reduction. And so we were concerned when we had values over 20%, which are highlighted in this particular table. Okay, so this is a table that we've generated that looks very similar in format to the wheat herbicide table that we have had in the weed control guide for several years. So this here, in our new guide on page 106, you'll find this table. And so we reviewed the database from up to 6 site years and then placed a risk assessment of either low, 0 to 20% injury, medium, 21 to 50, and then greater than 50 was assessed a high risk. And you notice that there's a number of herbicides that are in those medium to high risk categories, and you notice a number of cover crops that seem to have a fair amount of sensitivity. So in summary, all herbicides did injure crops, but not consistently. And so those we're most concerned about is where we assess the medium and high injury. And so the list, or the bullet point, shows those that are ranked highest and then decreasing. So we're most concerned with injury from the pursuit and valor. On the crop side, barley, rye, and field pea were the most tolerant. And then on the other end of the scale, the radish, turnip, and rapeseed or canola, we're concerned about. It was more susceptible. So study number 2 is some work that we've done over the last couple of years and will continue. And in this study, what we're after is, what is the appropriate fall planting rate and date for rye based on your cover crop goals? And for today's purpose, certainly our goal would be to have weed suppression. This study also is being supported by the Soybean Council. So this is a look at some data from this past season at Carrington. And note that the dates of the rye planting, the end of September and then the early November, and then the rates ranging from 25 to 75 pounds. The results are shown in rye plant density. I think most important is that what we ended up with a density, and so quite a variation there. You will notice as we move into the weed suppression, and the evaluation was done just before glyphosate was applied across the trial to terminate the rye for the soybeans. And so you notice on both foxtail and kochia, as would be expected when we planted earlier, and as the rates increased, we did see at least an increasing trend of improved control or suppression of the two weeds. Very disappointing weed control with the late planting and even with the highest rate. So in summary, this is still a study in place, but the preliminary data on weed control with foxtail in 2019, it didn't make any difference amongst the treatments. But this past season, as I showed, earlier planting in the fall certainly appears to have benefits. And then if we can achieve a rye density of 800,000 or more plants per acre, which is about 18 plants per square foot, that would give us more power in suppressing weeds. And also in both years, we had very good soybean yields, and the treatments had really no impact on the soybean plant development as well as yield. Okay, this is study number 3. I've talked about this in the past during the weeds workshop, but now we have 4 years of data, and what some questions we're answering, we're trying to answer are, can we maintain our pinto bean yield? What is the best time to terminate the rye? And for today's purpose, certainly, is it really useful for weed control? And this trial is supported by North Harvest Bean Growers Association. Okay, so this is yield data from treatments that we used in this past season. So I want to go through and just very quickly describe the 6 treatments that were used. And so all of the treatments were designed on termination timing of the rye in relationship to when the dry beans are planted. And so this year, the beans are planted on June 4th. The first treatment is really our untreated check. We did tillage in the fall to take out the rye. And then in the spring, we used glyphosate and a pre-emergence herbicide, which was Spartan Elite, right after planting. So that's compared to the other 5 treatments. Number 2 and 3 are both where over a month before we planted the beans, we applied glyphosate to kill the rye. But number 3 also had a pre-emergence herbicide application. So we wanted to compare number 3 to number 2 to see with number 2 with only rye residue present for quite a while before the beans are planted, how much suppression there was. Treatment 4 is the application of glyphosate about 3 weeks before bean planting. And then treatments 5 and 6 are what we call planting green, where the dry beans are planted into living rye. And then terminated just 1 day after planting in treatment 5 and 10 days after in treatment 6. By now you notice the yield and a very disappointing yield with treatments 5 and 6. And that was because our topsoil dried out by allowing the rye to grow as long as we did. And so we were able to establish a good stand of dry beans with treatments 5 and 6, but it took a long time. In fact, it got to late June before we had adequate rain to get a stand established. And so that also hit us on the tail end. In early September, when we had those 2 days of killing frost, that terminated the dry beans before it was mature, versus the treatments 1 through 4, they were at physiological maturity when the frost occurred. And so this is a look at the weed control from the trial last year. And so if you look at treatment 2 and 4, where only glyphosate was applied prior to the bean planting, you see the assessment of foxtail and common lamb's quarter was reduced compared to the other treatments. With treatments 1 and 2, we did have the pre-emergence herbicide, and treatments 5 and 6 with the rye being allowed to live until or after the dry bean planting, we had very excellent control of the weed species present, and very similar to where we use the pre-emergence herbicide in treatments 1 and 3. And this is a summary over years, actually 3 years, looking at the same basic relationship. With the column on the right hand of the slide, you see that when we allowed the rye to grow until around planting time, it had a good impact on reducing the foxtail. And with the other treatments, you see that even with pre-emergence herbicide, there was a trend for less weed control present. But there's a balance there, and that's what I want to show on the next slide. So this is the pinto bean yield over 3 years, and actually with all 4 years that we conducted the trial, we did have dry conditions, at least in the topsoil at planting time and establishment. And so because of that, even though we had good weed control or adequate weed control by allowing the rye to live up to planting time, the downside is that we lost topsoil moisture from the late rye growth that was needed by the dry beans for adequate establishment and development. And so turning the rye ahead of time, ahead of planting, certainly provided a yield advantage. So there's a balance. We like the rye to live as long as possible to help with weed management, but we don't want that to impact negatively the bean yield. So that's the balance that we have. We have found that certainly rye can supplement our soil applied herbicides. You know, it could potentially be a substitute, but it's much better to consider another tool or a supplement to a soil applied herbicide. With rye, it will allow a timely post-emergence herbicide application because the rye will reduce weed density. The weeds are smaller and quite uniform in size. So that's an advantage to be as effective as you can with whatever post-emergence herbicide we use. And just watch for some tolerant weed species. The weeds that are in the legume family or the mint family, and examples are shown, they might surprise you and be present with this system. So what I did here is I summarized the work that we've done with winter rye, with soybean and pinto bean. And so we have adequate database with foxtail and just one site year of data with common lamb's quarter and kochia. So note the average. Certainly we can say that winter rye as part of the system can suppress weeds. And it was a little disappointing with kochia, but we'll see what more trials will bring. Also notice the range. Sometimes we see excellent control, like some prior slides I showed you, and other times very disappointing control. So again, it seems like winter rye fits better as a supplement instead of the main source of managing our weeds. And trial number 4. What we're looking at here is tolerance of broadleaf crops to pre-plant low-rate dicamba for early season weed control. So we know there's a limited number of pre-plant burn down herbicides that are available for soybean, and even more so, very few available for dry bean and sunflower, where we can provide early season broadleaf weed control, especially herbicide-resistant broadleaf weeds, and also have a soil environment where we can safely plant the crops. And of course, we like products that are low in cost. And so dicamba will fit these factors, but we are certainly concerned about the potential crop injury. When we look at labels, certainly everyone knows that there's a waiting period between application of dicamba, even at low rates, and then growing the crops, planting the crops. And then also herbicide restrictions are that there's restrictions on annual rainfall. So all of this because of the potential crop injury. This past growing season, spring of 2020, we had a number of questions from across the state actually with people considering this strategy. And so at Carrington, we did place a study last year. It was actually fairly late in this environment that really promoted crop safety, because we had warm soils that we planted the crops in, and we had plenty of moisture moving through the environment, rainfall and especially irrigation. And so ultimately, with the three crops we grew, the sunflower, dry bean, and soybean, we saw very little injury. The only injury I observed was with the dry bean, and that actually enlarged cotyledon leaves. But after that, injury was very normal for the dry bean as well as the other crops. So it gave us some good experience on how to conduct a trial like this to generate the best amount of information. And so what we're planning in the future is shown in the next slide. So with support from the Soybean Council, we are going to go ahead with a formal study to look at this strategy. And so our objective is simply, we want to build a database to provide a reference for farmers or crop advisors if you're considering use of the strategy. We'll do the work at Carrington under irrigation, and then also at Minot and Fargo. And three crops already mentioned, but we'll be working with them: soybean, pinto bean, and sunflower. And the treatments are untreated crop, check. And then with the pre-plant dicamba, we'll apply that probably the first half of May, using Clarity or a generic applied at 4 fluid ounces of product. And then on the timing of the planting of the crops, we're going to target within 1 week after the dicamba was applied, and then 2 weeks more after. And then in addition, we're also going to consider rainfall, and ideally, we'd like to make the first planting before significant rains, such as 1 inch, and then the second timing would be planting the crops after 1 inch of rainfall or more. We can manage this somewhat with irrigation at Carrington, but we'll have different environments, and it'll be very interesting to see the outcome on injury. And the last slide. That'll conclude my comments. If there's any questions, I'd try to answer them.
All right, thank you, Greg. So I think what we'll do is advance the next slide as well to the QR code while we go through some questions. And again, this will be up over break as well. So a number of questions here, Greg. The first one, I think this goes back to your cover crop data you were presenting. Have you thought of trying a growth regulator? So I think the question is maybe dicamba and extend soybeans and then planting cover crops after that.